So today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for future review by our members in our webinar library. The session will run for approximately an hour in total. Everyone is muted, but you can type your questions into the Q&A box on the bottom bar, and the speaker will address specific questions from you during or after the presentation. So please don't hesitate to ask their questions throughout the Q&A or at any point during the session. And to assist our speaker, we ask that you keep your questions concise and related to today's presentation. As we are a bilingual chapter, you may ask your questions in French as well, and I can help translate the Q&A portion for that. Before we begin, we need to inform you of some of our important guidelines to ensure the integrity and respect for the intellectual property of our presenter. These measures are in place to protect the copyright material of our presenter and maintain the integrity of the content being shared. Please be advised that recording this webinar in any form is strictly prohibited. This includes, but is not limited to, audio, video, and photographic recording. Utilizing any external software or tools to record or transmit the content of this webinar is also strictly forbidden. The use of artificial intelligence or AI tools or assistants during this webinar is limited to the individual viewing the webinar, and AI should only be used for the purposes of increased accessibility or other support for the individual viewer. Any products of an AI tool or assistant may not be shared or publicly disseminated. And on that note, this webinar is enabled for translation captions, and you should be able to choose the language of your captions in your Zoom screen in front of you. Should you require a transcript of this webinar in English, please feel free to request one via info@ser.org. We are more than happy to provide this for your personal use and reference, and we thank you for your understanding and cooperation. Now that the housekeeping is aside, I'd like to provide a bit more information on today's speaker and presentation topic. Today's presenter is Holly Abbandonato. Dr. Holly Abbandonato is a plant ecologist with Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Atlantic side, where she has worked since 2022. She earned her PhD in Earth and Environmental Science from the University of Pavia in 2017, following an MSc from the Arctic University of Norway in 2014. She also holds not one, not two, but 3 degrees from the University of New Brunswick, a BSc ENR in Environment and Natural Resources in 2012, a BSc in Biology in 2011, and a BA in Anthropology in 2011. Dr. Abbandonato serves on the steering committee for Canada's National Native Seed Strategy. Her current research focuses on salt marsh restoration and carbon sequestration in Atlantic Canada. This webinar will explore the myths and best practices of native seed collection and use. Participants will gain insights into the key differences between agronomic and native seeds, highlighting how native seeds exemplify ecological resistance, foster biodiversity, and thrive in local ecosystems. And now, to begin the webinar, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Holly Abbandonato. Holly, I've stopped sharing, so I think you should be able to now.
Thank you, Shauna. I was going to say you found a gem of a photo of me. That's from 2012. I was a baby then.
It's your ResearchGate photo.
I know, and I haven't updated it. I like looking forever young. Anyways, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen right now. Just give me a second. This one. Share. And then swap that. All right, everything look okay?
Looks beautiful.
Great, thank you very much. Before I get started and introduce myself, I thought I would give the audience the opportunity to tell me a little bit about yourself. So I would love to know which organization you're based at and where you are, whether it's in Canada, the US, or maybe even other parts of the world. I'll be very much impressed if I do see people from multiple countries. And so, as Shauna mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about native seed collection myths and best practices. This is really a general introduction. Oh, I see a raised hand already. A general introduction to native seed collection. Probably could have 3 or 4 different webinars on how to handle, collect, sow, and use and monitor native seeds. But I want to focus on some of these really important key best practices that we can either think about or consider before we start collecting seeds. And so, as Shauna mentioned, I'm a plant ecologist. at Ducks Unlimited Canada. And so I'm based right on the border of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia in Amherst. And I also recognize that I'm situated within the territory of the Mi'kmaq, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. All right. So a little bit about me. So besides being a plant ecologist, which I've already mentioned, I am doing a lot of work on carbon sequestration within wetlands, particularly in Atlantic Canada and salt marshes. However, native seeds are something that I studied during my PhD, and I am currently still active when it comes to working within Canada as a committee member on the National Native Seed Strategy of Canada. And so I completed my PhD in 2017, and this is where I got to spend time doing everything seed. And so it was a really unique PhD program. It was a Marie Sklodowska Curie Action Fellowship. And so the main host was the University of Pavia. However, I was based in the Italian Alps at the Science Museum of Trento. And so this was a project with 11 PhD students, one postdoc, and the main focus was to create an interdisciplinary approach to a sustainable and dynamic European native seed industry. We had 7 main partners throughout Europe, and my partners specifically that supported my project were based at Kew Gardens, specifically the Millennium Seed Bank, and then Musée, or the Science Museum of Trento. And so the name of the project was the Native Seed Science, Technology, and Conservation Initial Training Network, or NASTEC. I won't go too much into my master's or bachelor's, just that for the most part during my master's, the focus was on plant phenology and climate change and the effects of snow depth. All right, I see some things coming in. I just want to take a quick peek. Okay, Quebec. Oh, California. Quebec. Atlantic Canada. Great. Ontario. Excellent. All right. There we go. And so this specific presentation is going to touch on 3 things. So first, we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to do some native seed trivia. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some seed myths and misconceptions, followed by best practices around native seed collection. All right, so we're going to launch, or I'm going to try, actually, maybe Shauna, you can do it for me.
I'm going to do my
Shauna,
best.
thank you. We're going to launch a Zoom poll. And so this is an opportunity for me to get to know a little bit about whether or not you use native seeds, as well as any experience you have and your general perception. And so this is an anonymous poll, so you can fill it in. No one will know your response, and we can see the results in real time, which is great. And so the first question asks how many of you have experience collecting native seeds. If you don't have experience, you can still answer the rest of the questions. Just pick a species you know really well and use that as if you were to go and collect seeds tomorrow. What kind of things would you do or expect to happen? All right, so I'll give you all some time to fill that out while I go through the chat and just see where everyone else is from.
People as far away as Perth, Australia joining us today. So thank you for joining us so late at night.
Peru as well. New York. Oh my goodness.
These answers are just pouring in. We've got about 70% of you have responded now. So it looks like most of the answers have come in now. It's sort of slowed to a trickle. Do you want me to stop the poll, Holly?
You can end it as long as we don't lose the results.
We won't.
Okay, then yes. I know
All right.
sometimes it can be a little. Okay, excellent. So I'm gonna see if I can keep it on the side while I go through slides. I'm hoping that works. But starting, okay, let's see. Yes, okay, great. Let me see it. Can everyone see the results of the poll as well? Is it like right on your screen?
I think I have to enable sharing the results.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I can also read them out, so that's not a problem either. So the first question is, how many of you have experience collecting native seeds? And so this is really just for me to get a sense of my audience. And this specific webinar is really going to talk about the do's and don'ts of seed collection. And for some of you, especially in the US, where the native seed industry is flourishing and quite ahead of Canada, this might be a review. All right, so in terms of the different answers, 71% of you have collected native seeds before. Well, that's pretty impressive. 9% have never collected native seeds before. 11% I plan to start collecting native seeds next year. And 9% I'm just curious and interested in this topic. All right, wow, that's great. All right, the second question, okay. When collecting native seeds, how many times per year would you typically visit your chosen population? And so in terms of the most common answer was, oh, it was almost once. It was once is 44%, 2 to 3 times is 45%, and more than 4 times is 11%. And so when we're thinking about collecting native seed, oftentimes it can be quite challenging to collect species that we don't know much about. So on the right here, I had an experiential learning student, and she was doing a native seed project related to creating mixes along wet meadows and wetlands. And so we had picked 3 species that we wanted to pick alongside sourcing seed elsewhere. And so one of those species was spotted Joe Pyeweed, that really tall plant. It's almost taller than her, as well as 2 other species. And I remember we ended up having to go 6 or 7 times just to determine whether that species was ripe, producing seeds, and then whether or not those seeds were actually detaching or mature enough to detach from the inflorescence. So one of the other species we looked at, for example, was blue vervain, which is this photo over here. I think you can see my cursor. And I remember we visited a stock that looked quite similar to this multiple times, but the seeds weren't ready to detach. And so sometimes you may have a sense of when that species might be ripe and dispersing seeds, but you may not always be there at the time when the species is going to detach seeds. And then separate to that is making sure that you are collecting seeds that are maturing at different times, because oftentimes species don't necessarily ripen all their seeds at once. So for example, if you look at some of these berries, it wouldn't really be in a plant's best interest to suddenly produce all its seeds, ripen them, and then a bird comes along or a flock of birds, and then all of those seeds are gone. And so in terms of adaptation, one of the things to think about is when we're collecting seed, we may not necessarily want to go just once, even though that's the most easy and cheaper way to collect seed. When we're thinking about native species, it might not always be in our best interest. And we'll talk a little bit more about genetic diversity later. All right, let me go to the next one. So the next question, when would you usually sow or spread wild collected native seeds? This one's kind of a trick question, and those who know something about native seeds might realize that. And so most people answered it depends on the species, 46%. And that is true, especially if you're in different parts of the world. But speaking of Canada, which I'm going to focus on for the most part in this webinar, when you're thinking about seeds, it's really important to remember that native species, or most of the native species that we have here in Canada, have some kind of dormancy. And so if we are collecting seeds and then thinking about sowing those seeds, if that dormancy hasn't been broken, one of the best things we can do is sow those seeds in the fall/winter, though winter here would be more complicated than winter in, say, the UK. And this way, those seeds are able to simulate that dormancy on their own without us having to either break that dormancy or potentially sow those seeds in the spring, which generally is that most common thought, and those seeds might actually be dormant and not germinate. And so it seems that 14% said spring, 33% fall, and 4% winter. That's pretty good, I have to say. I think this audience knows something about native seeds. All right, let's go to the next question. How would you typically store collected seeds for use the following year? 52% said in the fridge. It's not a bad answer. 19% said other. That's fine. I don't think there's a place to write it. 15% said in a paper bag at room temperature. Very good. 9% said no specific method, and 4% said in a jar at room temperature. Actually, one of my biggest pet peeves is photos of seeds in jars. And so when we talk a little bit more about seed anatomy and desiccation tolerance, we'll talk about how a lot of seeds need to be able to dry and breathe and not risk getting moldy or wet in order to maintain that seed vigor. So if you take newly collected seeds and throw them in a jar, those seeds are probably not going to live for very long. Unless, of course, you throw in some packs of silica gel, or if you dry them first, put them in and then pop in some silica gel. So in terms of the best way to store those seeds, when we're talking about orthodox, which I'll define a little later, we want to essentially think about keeping them in something that's breathable, that will maintain a very low relative humidity and keep those seeds quite dry. All right. Next question, question 5. After sowing native seeds, what percentage of germination would you typically expect? We have less than 40. Wow. Okay, I think this audience knows something about native seeds for sure. 38% chose 50 to 60. 19% chose 70 to 80. And then 2% chose 90 to 95, and 0 chose 100. Okay, yeah, I definitely get the sense that this audience knows a little something. So that's great. And that is exactly what I would not expect you to know. So I'm really impressed. So yes, for the most part, germination can be quite low, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the seeds are no longer living. And we'll talk about that in the next question. Okay, the last question, 6. If a portion of seeds fails to germinate immediately, what would you assume is the reason? The seeds are dead, the seeds are poor quality, the seeds are dormant, the seeds are not well suited to the environment, or I don't know. So the most commonly selected was the seeds are dormant. Very good. Followed by the seeds are dead. Yeah, that can happen. A certain proportion can be dead. Followed by the seeds are not well suited to the environment. The seeds are poor quality. And then, oops, I skipped actually, I don't know, which lied around 17%. And so something that is really important to emphasize with native seeds, whether you're a practitioner, seed collector, seed researcher, is thinking about seed germination and not assuming that germination is enough to be able to gauge whether or not how many seeds are live. And so specifically with orthodox seeds, these seeds tend to have some form of dormancy. And so depending on whether or not it met some kind of condition to overcome that dormancy, using germination alone is often misleading. And even in the lab, it can be really challenging because there's not enough research on a lot of native species. Even though we might know the type of dormancy, we may not be able to overcome that dormancy and all those environmental cues those seeds need to germinate. And so making sure that we think about alternative tests like viability tests, which we'll talk about a little later, are quite advantageous to get a sense for how many seeds are live, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to germinate when you subject them to some kind of setting, whether in the lab or in the field. Okay, so seed misconceptions. I don't think this audience has a whole lot of them because it seems you are very knowledgeable on using native seeds. However, I still want to mention them a little bit because it is important to think about where we get our seed perceptions from. And so specifically, when we're thinking about how we view seeds, our seed practices are largely shaped by agronomic, horticultural, and even some forestry seed needs. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's when we think about the first time we ever held a seed packet, it was probably not native seeds, though who knows, maybe today that's starting to be the case for some people. But I remember when I was little, seed packets were mainly vegetable seeds or wildflower seeds or some other kind of commercially produced seed that wasn't native. And so a lot of these type of seeds have some seed perceptions that really just don't apply so well to native species. So for example, if you're thinking about collecting your own seeds in your garden, you might just do it once in the fall. When you're thinking about when you sow those seeds, most, not all, but a lot of seed packets tell you to sow your seeds in the spring or late spring, early summer. A lot of seeds with dormancy might tell you to store them in the fridge to overcome that dormancy. And then regarding germination, usually when you sow, whether it's vegetable seeds or fruit seeds or crop seeds, you expect that germination to occur more or less at the same time in that early spring, summer, and you expect a high proportion of germination. You don't typically expect that 40% of your seeds are going to germinate unless, you know, you threw them on the ground and stomped on them or you left them somewhere you shouldn't have. And so the reason that seeds tend to be perceived this way is not necessarily a negative thing, but it's related a lot to how seeds behave in order to sell them and patent different types of seeds, vegetables, crops, etc. And so in order to have intellectual property rights, you need to conform to very strict standards. And so those standards are DUS, or distinctness, uniformity, and stability. And so when we think about distinctness, we're talking about creating, for example, a variety. Maybe you've created lettuce that tastes like cotton candy and nobody else in the market has done that. So this is a distinct product. In terms of making sure that it's uniform, there have to be individual characteristics that this specific species has. So maybe when you eat that lettuce, you taste cotton candy, and the specific leaf color has pink stripes. And so you need to be able to describe these characteristics for your specific variety. And then in terms of stability, making sure that every seed has these characteristics. So you wouldn't expect seeds to have, for example, leaves with different colors. You would want those specific characteristics to be maintained after propagation. And so seeds like this are pretty highly regulated. Not only do they have to conform to DUS, but they have to be, they're able to be certified and managed by the Federal Seed Act. And so there's specific information required for those seeds. For example, a certain percentage of weed seed is allowed to be there, or maybe there's none. I think it used to be 5%. I forget what it is these days. Noxious weed seeds are tested for, germination is tested. And you can see too in a lot of varieties, dormancy is no longer there. Even if that wild crop relative of, say, lettuce had dormancy, when we're talking about varieties, oftentimes dormancy is one of the first things to be removed. Okay, and so many wild traits have been removed due to plant breeding. And so I really wanted to emphasize that we should reset our seed assumptions, though, again, I don't know that this audience needs that. But for the most part, what we think about when we think about seed is these horticultural and agronomic species and how those seeds behave. However, native seeds are just not acting that way. They tend to even require the opposite, because with native seeds, we are thinking about protecting and supporting genetic diversity. And so we don't want our plants to all have exactly the same characteristics and phenotypes. We want them to be adaptable and resilient to change and variability. We often want to source them from multiple local seed sources rather than one. Again, that's to focus on supporting genetic diversity. We want, for example, those seeds to have a diverse timing of when those seeds mature. We don't necessarily want to be focusing only on picking seeds that mature at one time, and then when we grow them, they only mature at that same time. We want a variety of seed maturation to help protect them from, for example, a flock of birds. And most importantly, we want to preserve seed dormancy. I mean, of course, you can still have treatments to break dormancy and sell seeds those ways, but we want to make sure that if we were to throw seeds down in the fall, that they wouldn't suddenly germinate instead of waiting and overwintering and waiting until the spring. And so dormancy is a really, really important cue, especially in North America, or the northern parts of a lot of North America, we have these pretty strong winters. And then this is mainly because we want our seed to be adaptable and resilient, especially with ongoing climate change. And of course, if our seeds are adaptable and resilient, they'll help to support biodiversity and wildlife and provide ecosystem services. All right. So I included a little video clip showing how we have essentially bred out certain traits, but I think that's obvious. We know that's the case. But this is a unique example that actually relates to seeds, in particular, a type of grass seed, and I find grass generally are overlooked. So I thought this would be a really great example. I think there's going to be a McDonald's ad first, just FYI. Hopefully this works.
We don't have ad for this. We don't have sound for this magnificent
You
McDonald's
don't have
ad.
sound?
No.
Okay, let me just see here. You can see it, but you can't hear anything.
Correct.
Okay, let me just see. Is there a YouTube setting that I'm missing? I can always open it up on YouTube if.
I
Let me
think on
just wait.
audio settings, you have to go to, where is it? They keep moving it.
Display settings.
I think it's on Zoom's actual audio settings.
Zoom. Okay. Display settings. Screen. Do I have to get out of sharing, or would it be?
Shouldn't have to.
Okay. Let me go back to full screen a second and go back to display. I wonder if it's related to that. I'm sorry, I forgot to test this with you. We'll just try for a couple more minutes, and if I can't, then we'll just skip it. It's a really short little video. Display screen. Oops. I'm only seeing camera and display screen. Okay. Oops. I just want to see if I switch it to the other. Oh, it's probably on the top, maybe. More. Hide video panel, show computer sound, on, off, mono. Oh, okay. Try that.
We're
Can you
good.
hear it? Okay. Oh, it's hard going between platforms.
Many of the ancestral grasses, like these wild oats from Israel, have a trick to ensure that their seeds are planted in the perfect place. Each seed head at the top carries two long bristles called awns. And when a seed drops the ground, these awns do something truly extraordinary. They walk. The awns twist as they dry out during the day, and then when they get wet, they untwist. Tiny hairs grip onto the ground, keeping the individual moving forward. In this way, the seeds work their way along the ground until eventually they find a rock to hide under, or a crack to drill into. This adaptation is useful for the plant, but not for us. It's hard to collect seeds when they drop off and walk away. So our ancestors selected plants whose seeds don't drop off, don't have legs, and don't bury themselves out of reach. They also selected those individuals which put their energy into developing much larger seeds. Close relationships like this have developed all over the world, producing the plants that are now our crops.
Okay. Great, I'm glad that worked. And so this is a really nice example of how even seed traits have been selected for various agronomic and sometimes even horticultural purposes. And so if humans disappeared tomorrow, these wild oats might not be, or at least the domestic version, might not be very successful in germinating without having these long awns that help it to move around. All right, okay, there we go. And so in terms of native seed collection and best practices, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the different processes related to collection, but I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about processing, seed quality testing, and dormancy, just because these are important things to be aware of when you're thinking about seed handling. And oftentimes when we collect seed, we're not just sowing them right away. In the perfect world, we might be, but it's often not what happens. And so when we're thinking about conducting some form of restoration, oftentimes we begin with some kind of habitat that we want to restore. We come up with a restoration plan. We start thinking about native seed sourcing and procurement. We begin to collect those seeds from natural populations. However, when we're starting to think about large-scale restoration, it just doesn't become sustainable to be collecting wild seed. And so that's when we'll see seed multiplication, native seed multiplication, starting to proliferate, and this industry is definitely much more established in the United States, in many countries in Europe and Australia, in Canada, less so. And so this is essentially to protect those wild populations from being overexploited for this purpose. All right, so when we're thinking about native seed needs, it is really important to do some planning and preparation. And so when we're thinking about doing some form of, whether it's a small restoration project, hopefully if you're only using collected seeds, or supporting some kind of project, you need to think about the quantity of the seed that you might need. You need to foreshadow this. Oftentimes, when you're sowing seeds, you don't want to leave a lot of bare, empty soil so that other exotics and pioneering species can come in. You want to think carefully about the species. Some species you may just not have access to, others you might. Where do these populations occur? In terms of time frame, when do you harvest them? And we talked too about the importance of harvesting them multiple times. If possible, how are you going to store those seeds, and when are you going to sow them? And then a little bit more on seed source. So in terms of best practices, locally adapted seed would be the gold standard. However, that's not always feasible, especially in Canada, where we just don't have a lot of native seed producers. And so we tend to use seed from other areas. But if we could use seeds from even our province, for example, locally adapted would be ideal. And then thinking too about not only just local seed, but thinking too about the environment and climatic conditions where that specific species grows. For example, what are the conditions like precipitation, temperature aspects, soil. And so in many countries, something called seed zones have been established for a variety of species. A lot of this started mainly with trees and is now starting to branch into non-woody species. And it's been developed more so in the USA and Europe. And so seed zones exist for even just individual species, groups, or specifically within a country. That is quite challenging for us in Canada, especially the Maritimes. And of course, we just don't have the producers. But when you're trying to think about, well, I don't have a seed zone, what would be considered a local area that would support the type of conditions I have, you can use actually this concept that was published in a paper creating Eastern seed zones for trees. And so what they did was they took two specific overlays, and they took the USDA plant hardiness zones, and then they took ecoregions, and they put them on top of each other, and they used those to create a type of seed zones specifically for trees. And so I was thinking about that myself. If I were to apply that in Atlantic Canada, we have one ecozone, so that keeps things fairly straightforward. But we have around 8 hardiness zones. And so roughly, I guess we would have about 8 seed zones within this region, which isn't too bad. And for those who don't know the area I'm talking about, I think you can see my mouse, I'm talking about this part mainly, and of course, for Newfoundland, but yeah, this area here. Quebec is a different story. It would be very challenging. There's actually a lot of both ecozones and plant hardiness zones, but it's a good starting point when you're trying to think what might be a locally adapted environment for me to source my seeds from. Regarding authorization, this is an important one. Plants are genetic, or seeds are genetic material. And so you want to make sure that you have authorization to collect seeds, whether it's on Crown land, whether it's private land, making sure you have the appropriate permits or landowner permission, making sure you're not picking species at risk without the appropriate authorization, and making sure you can identify that species. So this is not native to North America, Calendula officinalis, but it's one of my favorite seeds because the seeds are really asymmetrical and they all look really different and they look like little spikes. But if you look at the flower versus what a mature set of seeds looks like, they don't really look that similar. And so just because you can identify a species when it's flowering doesn't necessarily mean you may be able to identify it when it's dispersing seeds. So just making sure you have some knowledge or support to help you identify them, because the alternative is you're either targeting the wrong species or you could risk picking exotic or weedy or invasive seeds. Thinking about timing, so when is that specific species fruiting and when are those seeds actually mature enough to disperse? And then thinking about collection days. So collection days for seeds can have both inter and intra-specific variation. So individual species might seed at different times, as well as even within different populations, you might see different maturity levels, depending even just on how the season's been, whether it's been really dry, really wet. In terms of populations, so we talked already a little bit about genetic diversity. So our goal with a lot of these restoration programs is we want to be able to sow something that will be resilient to change and adaptable. We don't want to sow seeds that will suddenly die in 1 or 2 years. And so in order to hedge our bets the most, we want to collect seed from different populations, and potential, or if possible, local populations. According to ENSCONET, which is the European Native Seeds Conservation Network, which is a nice manual that talks about seed collection, but also seed banking, mentions that 5 populations would be the gold standard, as they would cover around 67 to 83% of alleles. Now, that may not always be possible, but if you can try to aim for more than one, I think that would be a good step in the right direction. In terms of collecting and cleaning, so talking about collecting, so just some very general field recommendations. Of course, depending on your region and the species you're picking, there could be some modifications to this, but for the most part, you shouldn't be picking more than 20% of mature seeds within a population. You want to be sustainable, and for example, if you think of annuals, they are quite dependent on those seeds. So if you remove more than that, you could risk impacting the local populations. When we're thinking about picking seeds, especially orthodox seeds or seeds, most of the seeds that we have here in Canada, you want something that's breathable because you don't want the seeds to get wet and then potentially rot or lose that longevity. So paper bags is really the easiest and best material to use. You can use cloth, but I will tell you from experience, it is really difficult to remove seeds from cloth bags. So if you can use paper, I would suggest that. Make sure you label your bags with the species, location, and date, especially the year, in case you don't use those seeds right away. And then you may or may not need gloves depending on the species. So looking at that wild oat, it had those long awns that might get into your skin. There could be spines, or there could even be poisonous material. So just thinking about your species carefully. And then if for some reason you have the appropriate permits to be picking rare species, make sure that you're doing it in an inconspicuous manner so that the public is not able to see that you're picking seeds of something they should not pick seeds of. And then, of course, avoiding trampling that population. The last thing that's really important is to think about that maturity. So making sure those seeds are easy to detach. That's a good sign that they have ripened sufficiently. You can gauge that somewhat by color. So green seeds tend to be immature, whereas brown to black is a good indicator, at least around here, that those seeds, especially if they're seeds, not berries, that they are mature. Fruits, of course, will have different indicators and colors. And so you see a wider range of green to red to black. And of course, green are not necessarily the ones you would pick either when it comes to fruits for the most part. And then if you absolutely have to pick seeds that are not ripe, so maybe they're a little green, or they're stuck, you can use something called after ripening for immature seeds where you leave them out to dry in ambient conditions. It's not perfect. Doesn't mean all your seeds are going to germinate, but it's an option for when you're not able to collect necessarily seeds when they're mature and easy to detach. In terms of care of collection, I'm not going to go too much into cleaning because that could be a whole webinar in itself. But if you can, when you're picking seeds, if you can do a little pre-cleaning, so removing things while you're in the field, so you can just grab the seed, maybe removing the fluff or awns, for example, or pods, and then thinking about post-cleaning to remove external debris, covering structures or dispersal units. And this is for the most part because we want to remove anything external that might enable different organisms, insects, to live in. We want to prevent our seeds from getting moist. So if we have a big leaf attached to our seeds, we might end up with more moisture than we want. And then thinking about seeds here in Canada, most again are orthodox. We'll talk about, I think, in the next slide. They do need to be dry. And so making sure that you do dry your seeds very well. And if you decide to store them in something that is not breathable, thinking about using, for example, little pouches of silica gel. I tend to save some from my clothes or shoe boxes. So throw them in the oven and then pop them in later when it cools with your seeds that are already dry for long-term storage or longer-term storage. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the groups of seeds. And so this is not directly related to collection, but indirectly it's very important to know this about the species that you're picking. And so this seed type is related to desiccation tolerance. And so this relates to when I'm talking about orthodox seeds versus recalcitrant seeds. So we'll look at this diagram in a second. So depending on their desiccation tolerance, they're adapted to different environmental conditions like temperature and humidity within their environment. It enables them to tolerate stress, so harsh conditions or even just varying conditions such as drought, changes in light, even metal toxicity. And the way that seeds are able to tolerate desiccation is based on the amount of water present within the seed or the internal water content. And so we can classify seeds into 3 groups, orthodox, intermediate, or recalcitrant. We're not really going to talk about intermediate too much. That's just sort of in the middle of the two. But orthodox seeds are seeds that are the most common here in Canada and parts of the US. And so these are generally seeds that are smaller in comparison to recalcitrant seeds that are larger. Some examples here are legumes and cereals, a lot of grasses. On the recalcitrant side, because they're larger seeds, they're often different types of fruit. And so these are just some domestic examples. Orthodox seeds have a low water content. And so it can be even as low or lower than 10%. And this enables them to tolerate desiccation. So they do not lose viability when water contents drop. But on the flip side, recalcitrant seeds do. And so they have a high water content of up to 60% or higher. And so they lose viability. They don't have a very good desiccation tolerance. And so desiccation tolerant orthodox seeds can withstand dehydration, recalcitrant cannot. And so one of the mechanisms they use to tolerate desiccation is they switch off their metabolism, whereas recalcitrant seeds cannot. So what does that mean? Well, that relates to their ability to become dormant. So when they switch off their metabolism, they're dormant, they're essentially sleeping, whereas recalcitrant seeds cannot do that. So they're ready to germinate. And so orthodox seeds tend to have a long storage lifespan, 5 to 10 years or more, and sometimes a lot more than that. And they're able to undergo dormancy, whereas the short storage lifespan occurs within recalcitrant seeds. And so when we're thinking about, for example, putting seeds in the freezer, this is something we can do, for example, with orthodox seeds after we dry them and remove that moisture. Whereas with recalcitrant seeds, this is something we can't do to store them long term, because if we freeze them with that high water content, the water will turn to ice and that will crack and break the embryo. And so one of the main tools that's used to store this group of seeds is to actually remove the embryo from the seed and cryopreserve that embryo alone. All right, so just a couple examples. So we talked about recalcitrant seeds having that high water content. Generally, they live in tropical to subtropical habitats, but there are some exceptions within temperate and aquatic habitats. So within tropical areas, they're considered late successional species because they cannot tolerate drought. They cannot tolerate a fluctuating habitat. They need to germinate in a habitat that is stable. They can be preserved. If you're picking seeds like that, you do need to maintain the moisture. And so if you have a species that's recalcitrant, you would usually put them in the fridge, and you would do so in plastic to hold that moisture in. Some examples of recalcitrant seeds are species like avocado, coffee, which don't relate so much to us, but ones that do: chestnut, oak, some maple species, even aquatic wetland species like saltmarsh cordgrass. Within the orthodox group, these are generally seen more in tropical environments as pioneering species. These are the groups that we dry after collection before we think about refrigerating or freezing. And this is pretty much most of the species that we see here in Canada. So it includes forbs, most graminoids. Again, there's some aquatics that don't fall here, most trees and most shrubs. And then, of course, intermediate would be a species with a moisture content between 45 and 65%. One in our area is wild rice. You can find some of this information on the Seed Information Database, which is on the SER website. Used to be on the Q website, but now it's been moved to SER. All right, this is my last slide. And so thinking about seed handling, it's really important to know, if you're picking an orthodox species, what kind of dormancy your seed has. And so there are a number of different types of dormancy. I won't go too much into the how and how they work. There's even combinational, so it can be relatively complex. But when you're thinking about collecting wild seed, you need to think about the type of dormancy, how it can impact sowing time. So when do you sow? Most likely, if it has dormancy and requires cold stratification, you might think of sowing it in the fall. And then, of course, if you don't want to do that and you're sowing it in the spring, how do you break that dormancy? Are you able to break it through cold stratification, scarification, embryo maturation, etc.? If you're doing research on native seeds, this book is pretty much, for me, my seed Bible. It's a great place to learn about dormancy, but also look up your species, because not all native species, actually a very small proportion, especially in Canada, of native species have been studied. So we really just don't have that kind of data. So you can use this book to look up genera as well as families to try to better understand the dormancy in your seed. And then germination. So this may not apply directly to native seed collectors, but if you're a restoration practitioner thinking about success, or you're doing research on a specific species, remembering that germination may be an indicator of live seed, but not of dormant viable seed. So if you're going to do any tests, thinking about also measuring viability alongside germination is a better measure. And so it's really easy to do. You can do something called a cut test, where you cut your embryo in half and you look for that nice, healthy white embryo. Tetrazolium tests are options if you have seed labs, for example, in the US, or if you have knowledge on identifying embryos. But otherwise, a cut test is an easy option. All right, so I'm going to finish here with some resources regarding native seeds. So SER does have a chapter called INSR, or the International Network for Seed-Based Restoration. You could potentially join that chapter, or even you can visit their website to learn about different news, webinars, events, opportunities, and resources. And they have now a native seed film, which is really cool. Great way to learn and see some of these things put in practice. And then lastly, thinking about the Seed Information Database before you're picking species, getting to learn a little bit about them regarding germination, seed type, desiccation tolerance. This is a great resource. All right, so that concludes my presentation, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Holly. We have a couple of them coming in through the Q&A section. So I'm just going to pull that up. I'm also going to share my screen because I don't think I'm going to have time to give my whole thank you spiel afterwards, if that's okay.
Yep, that's fine. So I'll stop
Perfect.
sharing
So
this.
you should have mine now. Whoop. So we have one question already that's come in from Matt Nettle. And Matt wants to know, do the seeds adapt, do the plants or seeds adapt to local conditions if the seeds are not sourced from the local area? Maybe a plant that's native to the range, but the seeds were sourced from somewhere else. And I was hoping you could answer that one.
Yes and no. So there are cases where that's happened, and a species from a non-local population does well or can even outcompete the local populations, and vice versa. Or there's chances where you bring in seed that just doesn't do well at all. And so there have been cases in the literature where both things have happened. And so because of those risks, it's generally advisable not to do that. But of course, I think that happens a lot in Canada too, because we just don't have the number of native seed producers as other countries.
Perfect. Thank you. We've also just got more of a comment rather than a question, that if it's not a spring cedar, you would plant it immediately, and it also depends on your species. So that one has come up in there. We have another question from Juliana Fernandez Renzotti, and she wants to know, do you have any other tips about halophyte seed storage?
Ooh, that's a really interesting topic. I actually haven't done really any of that yet, though I've thought about it, and I do know of one grad project. I would assume a good proportion are probably recalcitrant, though there may be a couple intermediates and orthodox. So I would say start with that SER seed information database. Keep in mind, it may not necessarily be up to date with new literature. So I would use that in combination with a literature search to see if you can find out and characterize the different halophytic species. But I have a feeling most are recalcitrant and need to be in water when you're storing them. Is it supposed to be salt water? That's another question. I'm not sure the answer. I don't know if you know, but you can put it in the chat.
Not my expertise, but if someone knows, they're more than welcome to. Next in the Q&A, do you have any advice or resources regarding non-flowering plant spore collection? And Vincent Laurie is thinking about ferns and club mosses here.
Oh, I wish I could say yes, but I don't have experience with that. It sounds really interesting though. I wish someone had taught me that, but no, I don't, sorry.
There are thousands of types of plants out there. We can't know every single one, unfortunately, but that sounds like a really good Anna question. Then we have one from Charles Mead. Oaks and maple are recalcitrant. How long should they be stored in plastic in the fridge, and what would be ideal to plant them?
I would say you would want to simulate winter. So depending on where you live, thinking about how long that is. Unlike orthodox, so there are a lot of seeds, for example, that need cold stratification as well as have immature embryos. So it's a combination of thinking about winter and allowing that embryo to mature. You don't have that issue with recalcitrant seeds because they're already metabolically active. So I would say probably it's just a matter of, well, you probably don't even have to simulate winter because they're metabolically active. So it's more about thinking about those spring conditions that might be suitable. Side note, most of my PhD was in orthodox species, so I'm not an expert, but I'm sure there are a lot of people or a lot of studies on oaks specifically. So you could look that up to get a better sense of how recalcitrant seeds function in comparison when you're planting them.
We have two more, and then I'm going to have to cut it because of time constraints. One is from Gabrielle Remock. What is the level of difficulty of collecting and germinating native ferns? Given the work with spores and rhizomes, I imagine this is quite complex, but they are important for a lot of biogeographic regions.
I don't know the answer at all. It's a great question. I don't want to assume anything because spores and seeds are just not the same. So I won't even try.
Fair enough. And then the last one that we have time for today is from Douglas Thamage. Would you have any experience with working with, oh boy, I can't pronounce this one. It's Mankenti nut, and then they put the scientific name, which I am not going to attempt, especially breaking dormancy.
I need to see the spelling, but probably not, because the seeds that I worked with are mostly forbs and graminoids, grassland, like temperate grassland species for my PhD specifically. So no, but again, check that SER seed information database. Check the Baskin and Baskin book as well.
Okay.
That would be the starting point that I would use for any species that was new to me or I didn't know anything about.
So we're about out of time. So I'd like to thank you once again, Holly, for an excellent presentation and for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate that you were able to host this webinar with us. And we'd like to thank everyone who's able to attend today's webinar. You will be getting a follow-up email, and we are able to provide a certificate of participation for anyone who is SERP certified. So if you just need that, you can email serec@ser.org, and I can provide that. I also encourage you to visit the SER website to see a list of our upcoming webinars, as there's a lot already in the plans for 2025, and as well to learn more about our work and the benefits of membership with our organization if you haven't joined yet. Additionally, a recording of today's webinar will be available soon for our SER members in the SER webinar library, which will be available only on demand for members, and that is available at ser.org/webinar library. And once again, thank you to all of our certified restoration practitioners who are in attendance today. This webinar was pre-approved for 1 continuing education credit. You can also check us out online. Our email's on the screen, as well as our website and our social media links for Facebook and LinkedIn. And as of last month, we're on YouTube too, because why not? We also will be hosting tomorrow for our French speaking and French listening people. We have our discussion forum, which is in French only, and it's our Pro Tips forum. So that's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And the theme will be the Etna Road Watercourse Project in Quebec City, which is a restoration project in Quebec City by the firm Fluvio, and it'll be hosted by François Gros. I will pop the link for this registration in the chat so that if you're interested, you can register. It will have French or English captions available, but it will be in French. So I'd love to thank everyone very much for coming today, and thank you again, Holly, for participating with us.
No problem. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.